Everything has to be paid for. Between 2008 and 2023, Israel and Hamas fought 11 rounds of escalation. Each round ended with a ceasefire. Each ceasefire required negotiation, international mediation, UN monitoring, and reconstruction aid. Each ceasefire lasted between several months and several years, then fighting resumed. The cost of 11 ceasefires, approximately $100 billion combined in reconstruction, humanitarian aid, military expenditures, and economic disruption. The cost of a permanent resolution, estimated $50–80 billion in compensation, development, and political settlement. The temporary solution costs twice as much as the permanent one, but the permanent one is politically impossible, so the temporary costs accumulate forever. This episode reveals the economics of ceasefires, how temporary peace costs more than continued war or permanent settlement, why short-term truces create long-term expenses, and how the cycle of violent ceasefire violence becomes the most expensive option that everyone chooses anyway. The ceasefire negotiation industry. Every ceasefire requires negotiation. Every negotiation costs money. The 2021 Israel-Gaza ceasefire was brokered by Egypt with support from the United States, UN, and EU. The negotiation process involved Egyptian intelligence officials shuttling between parties, U.S. diplomatic engagement at highest levels, UN Special Coordinator involvement, international calls and meetings. Estimated cost of the negotiation process, $50–100 million in diplomatic resources, travel, security, communication infrastructure, and opportunity costs of high-level official time. The ceasefire lasted until 2023, approximately 2 years before the next major escalation. Cost per year of ceasefire, $25–50 million just for the negotiation that achieved it. Syria's conflict has seen dozens of attempted ceasefires since 2011. The UN-mediated Geneva process alone has cost an estimated $200–300 million over multiple rounds, according to UN budgetary data and diplomatic assessments. Most of these ceasefires collapsed within weeks or months. The cost per successful ceasefire day achieved is astronomical. The Minsk agreements attempting to resolve Ukraine's Donbas conflict, 2014–2015, involved multiple rounds of negotiations in Belarus, French and German leaders' direct involvement, Normandy format, OCE monitoring mission establishment, international working groups. Total cost of Minsk process, estimated $100–150 million in direct diplomatic costs, plus billions in monitoring and implementation attempts. The agreements were repeatedly violated and ultimately failed completely by 2022. They said ceasefires would reduce costs by stopping fighting. They got additional costs for negotiating temporary pauses before fighting resumed. The monitoring cost multiplication. Ceasefires require monitoring. Monitoring requires infrastructure, personnel, and continuous funding. The UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO, monitoring Israel's various ceasefires, has operated since 1948, 76 years. Annual budget, approximately $70–80 million. Cumulative cost, approximately $5.3 billion over 76 years, adjusted for inflation. The UN Disengagement Observer Force, UNDOF, monitoring Israel-Syria ceasefire on the Golan Heights, has operated since 1974, 50 years. Annual budget, approximately $65 million. Cumulative cost, approximately $325 billion. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, established to monitor the Minsk ceasefire, operated from 2014–2022. Peak annual budget, approximately $110 million. Total cost over 8 years, approximately $880 million to monitor a ceasefire that ultimately failed. These monitoring missions don't prevent violations, they document them. The fighting continues, the monitors remain, the costs accumulate. The monitoring becomes permanent even though the ceasefires are temporary. The reconstruction cycle economics. Temporary ceasefires create reconstruction cycles that cost far more than preventing destruction. Gaza has experienced this pattern repeatedly. Operation Cast Lead, 2008-09. $2 billion in destruction, $500 million in reconstruction aid. Operation Pillar of Defense, 2012. $1.5 billion in destruction, $400 million in reconstruction aid. Operation Protective Edge, 2014. $5 billion destruction, $3 billion in reconstruction aid pledged, much not delivered. 2021 escalation, $500 million in destruction, $500 million in reconstruction aid. 2023-24 war, $20+ billion in destruction, reconstruction costs unknown but will exceed $50 billion. Total cycle cost, approximately $80+ billion in destruction and reconstruction over 15 years. But here's the economic absurdity. Much of what gets reconstructed is destroyed again in the next round. A hospital built with $10 million in aid in 2009 gets damaged in 2012, repaired with $3 million in 2013, destroyed in 2014, rebuilt with $12 million in 2015, damaged in 2021 and obliterated in 2023. Total spent on one hospital, $37 million over multiple cycles. A hospital that would cost $15 million to build once cost $37 million through repeated destruction-reconstruction cycles. The ceasefire creates the illusion that reconstruction is progress. Actually, it's just preparing infrastructure for the next round of destruction. The rearmament economics. Temporary ceasefires don't demilitarize, they enable rearmament. Hamas uses ceasefire periods to rebuild rocket inventory, estimated 10,000, 15,000 rockets rebuilt between major conflicts. Reconstruct tunnels, 90-100 million estimated expenditure. Train fighters and develop capabilities. Stockpile weapons and supplies. Israel uses ceasefire periods to replenish Iron Dome interceptors, $50,000 each x thousands, all hundreds of millions. Upgrade defensive systems, $500+ million. Enhance intelligence capabilities. Prepare for next round. Both sides spend billions during ceasefires preparing for the next war. The ceasefire doesn't reduce military spending, it redirects it from active operations to preparation. The result: ceasefires cost almost as much militarily as active conflict because all parties use the pause to prepare for resumption. Syria's multiple ceasefires showed this pattern. Each pause allowed all factions to reposition forces, resupply weapons, recruit and train fighters, prepare offensives. The ceasefires didn't reduce military expenditures. They created operational pauses that made subsequent fighting more expensive and destructive. The humanitarian aid perpetuation. Temporary ceasefires create permanent humanitarian aid dependencies. Gaza receives approximately $800 million to $1.2 billion in annual humanitarian aid, according to UN and donor data. This has continued for decades through multiple conflict cycles. The aid addresses humanitarian needs created by repeated conflicts and blockades, but because conflicts recur, the needs never end. Cumulative humanitarian aid to Gaza since 2007, approximately $15–20 billion. This aid doesn't resolve the conflict. It sustains a situation where people survive but nothing improves. Each ceasefire period requires continued massive aid because the underlying situation remains unchanged. Syria has received approximately $40 billion in humanitarian aid since 2011, according to UN OCHA Financial Tracking Service. The aid keeps people alive through temporary ceasefires and continued fighting. But the fundamental problem, the war itself, continues. The humanitarian spending is infinite because the ceasefires are temporary. They said humanitarian aid would help during ceasefires until peace arrives. They got permanent aid dependencies because peace never arrives. The economic disruption continuation. Temporary ceasefires don't restore economic activity. They create uncertainty that prevents investment. Gaza's economy has operated in a state of permanent crisis through multiple ceasefires. Unemployment, 45–50%. Poverty rate, 60–80%. Businesses don't invest during ceasefires because they know fighting will resume. Infrastructure isn't built because it will be destroyed. Economic planning is impossible. The result, ceasefires maintain economic depression without enabling recovery. The World Bank estimated in 2023 that Gaza's economic losses from the conflict cycle since 2007 totaled approximately $15 to $20 billion in lost GDP, separate from physical destruction. This is the opportunity cost of temporary ceasefires. Economies that neither grow during peace nor stabilize after conflict, existing in permanent limbo. Syria's economy contracted by 60% during the conflict despite multiple ceasefires. Each ceasefire raised hopes of recovery. Each resumption of fighting destroyed those hopes. The economic damage from uncertainty and instability exceeds the direct costs of fighting. The comparison with permanent settlements. Permanent conflict resolutions cost more up front but less over time. Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement, 1998, required extensive negotiations, $50 million. Political restructuring, $200 million. Decommissioning of weapons, $100 million. Economic development funds, $10+ billion over decades. Total front-loaded cost, approximately $500 million for the political settlement, plus $10+ billion in long-term development. But the violence ended. The ongoing costs, while still substantial, are development costs, not conflict costs. Compare this to Israel-Palestine, which has had dozens of temporary ceasefires but no permanent settlement. Cumulative negotiation costs, $500+ million. Monitoring missions, $10+ billion. Repeated reconstruction, $100+ billion. Ongoing military spending, $500+ billion. Humanitarian aid, $50+ billion. Total $600+ billion over decades with no resolution. The permanent settlement that might cost $50–80 billion, land compensation, development, security arrangements, etc., remains politically impossible. So the temporary solutions that cost $600+ billion continue. The Korean model of permanent costs. The Korean Armistice, 1953, created a permanent ceasefire, not peace but not resumed war. This has cost UN monitoring mission, $50+ million annually x 71 years, $3.5+ billion. South Korean military maintenance, $40+ billion annually x 71 years, or $2.8+ trillion. U.S. troop presence, $20+ billion annually x 71 years, $1.4+ trillion. North Korean military spending, unknown but likely $1+ trillion cumulative. Total $5+ trillion to maintain a 71-year ceasefire. Would a permanent peace settlement in 1953 have cost $5 trillion? Obviously not. But achieving peace was politically impossible. The ceasefire became permanent. The costs became infinite. This is the economic trap of ceasefires that don't transition to peace. They create permanent expense without permanent resolution. The short-term political logic. Ceasefires persist despite economic irrationality because of short-term political logic. For leaders, achieving a ceasefire is a political victory. It stops immediate violence. It allows declaration of success. It postpones difficult decisions. The economic costs are long-term and diffuse. The political benefits are immediate and concentrated. Israeli leaders who achieve ceasefires with Hamas get credit for stopping rocket fire. The cost of the next round is a future problem. Hamas leaders who achieve ceasefires get credit for survival and international recognition. The cost of the next round is someone else's problem. Syrian faction leaders who achieve ceasefires demonstrate their importance to international backers. The cost of resumed fighting gets paid by someone else. The political incentives favor temporary solutions even when they're economically catastrophic. The international enablement. International actors enable the ceasefire cycle by funding reconstruction without demanding permanent solutions. Donor countries provide billions for Gaza reconstruction after each conflict. This allows Israel and Hamas to fight again, knowing the international community will pay to rebuild. The World Bank provides reconstruction funding for Syria despite repeated ceasefire violations. This allows factions to continue, knowing rebuilding costs will be externalized. International funding of reconstruction removes economic pressure for permanent settlements. Why pay for permanent peace when donors will pay to rebuild after temporary wars? The donors intend to reduce suffering. They actually enable conflict continuation by subsidizing the destruction-reconstruction cycle. The business model of ceasefires. Some actors profit from ceasefire cycles. Construction companies in Gaza, Israel, and internationally profit from repeated reconstruction. Each conflict creates demand. Each ceasefire creates contracts. Arms dealers profit from rearmament during ceasefires. Each pause creates demand for restocking. Humanitarian organizations expand operations during ceasefires. Each temporary peace creates funding requests. These actors don't want permanent war. That's too destructive. But they don't benefit from permanent peace that eliminates demand. Temporary ceasefires with periodic conflict create the optimal business environment for these industries. This creates constituencies with economic interests in maintaining the cycle rather than breaking it. The generational cost transfer. Ceasefire cycles transfer costs across generations. Children born in Gaza in 2008 have lived through 5 major conflicts separated by temporary ceasefires. They've experienced repeated displacement, trauma, disruption of education, and economic deprivation. The economic cost of this isn't just current GDP loss, it's permanent human capital degradation. Reduced education, reduced health, reduced productivity for their entire lives. The World Bank estimates that each year of conflict-affected childhood reduces lifetime earnings by 10–20%. Multiple conflict cycles compound this. Gaza's children inherit an economy destroyed by temporary ceasefires that never became permanent peace. Syrian children born in 2011 have lived their entire lives in a cycle of temporary ceasefires and resumed fighting. Their education has been repeatedly disrupted. Their economic prospects are minimal. The ceasefire doesn't protect them from costs. It just spreads those costs across their lifetimes. The irreversibility of accumulated costs. Each ceasefire round adds costs that don't disappear when peace finally comes. Debt-accumulated financing conflicts must still be repaid. Infrastructure destroyed and rebuilt multiple times has consumed resources that can't be recovered. Human capital lost to repeated disruptions can't be restored. When peace eventually arrives, if it arrives, the accumulated costs of temporary ceasefires will be enormous. Gaza's eventual permanent resolution, whenever it comes, will inherit destroyed infrastructure requiring 50+ billion to rebuild, traumatized population requiring billions in mental health services, lost generation of education requiring decades to recover, destroyed economy requiring complete reconstruction. These costs accumulated through dozens of temporary ceasefires. A permanent settlement in 2008 would have avoided 80% of these costs. The system revelation. Temporary ceasefires are economically insane. They cost more than continued fighting or permanent peace. But they're politically optimal. Leaders get credit for stopping violence without making difficult compromises. The economic logic says, pay $50 billion once for permanent peace. The political logic says, pay $5 billion every few years for temporary ceasefires that satisfy no one but offend no one. Over 20 years, the political logic costs $100+ billion. But political careers don't last 20 years. The next conflict is the next leader's problem. Everything has to be paid for, and temporary ceasefires are paid for infinitely in repeated negotiations, permanent monitoring missions, cyclical reconstruction, endless humanitarian aid, and accumulated damage that compounds with each round, making the temporary solution the most expensive option that everyone chooses because permanent solutions require political courage no one possesses. Subscribe to The Price of Conflict to understand how temporary peace costs more than permanent war.